Hello, everybody. It is Monday, the 20th of April. I'm coming to you from Hamtopia. This is Bevy, and we are beginning on the third book in the 9-book compilation called The Reaper and the Scribe by John Paul Burnett, and this one is called A Date with the Reaper. In the 21st century, Alice Winters Chambers' future is now set. A meeting has been preordained for her to take on the next step from the evolution of a simple boat girl to a business mogul, or perhaps the world's savior. Only time will tell. We now concentrate on the past, moving on from the Victorian era, as Frederick Winters, his wife Glenda, and their two children, Jacob Albert and Alice Samantha, have taken the baton passed on to them by Alice, John, and James Winters, all of whom now lay at peace with their parents. The future that Alice Winters dreamed of will now take a darker turn. The company established by Albert and Doris Winters, which took a new direction with their children, Alice, John, and James, is about to venture across the Atlantic Ocean and expand into the lucrative transatlantic passenger market, currently dominated by the Cunard and White Star lines. This concluding prequel follows on from April 1912, as Frederick Winters, the only son of Alice Winters, prepares to board a ship bound for America. Chapter 30. It was a bright and cheerful April morning, and the last breakfast that the Winters family would be having for a good while together was being enjoyed. Little Alice had an announcement to make. "Look, Father, my finger is now large enough for Granny's ring." "So it is. How wonderful! Granny Alice would be happy and at peace, knowing that ring is on your finger. It pleases me as well, and as I'm going to be away for a while, it lets me know that things are moving along how they should, and I will take comfort in that during my long voyage." "What time is your train?" asked Glenda. "In an hour, my dear, so I think it's time for goodbyes," smiled Frederick. "Not goodbye, Frederick. I don't like goodbyes. I prefer to say au revoir," said a sad, pouting Glenda. "Au revoir it is, then," said Frederick, as he confidently placed his bowler hat upon his head. He shook the hand of his son and told him to be strong whilst he was away, to be there for his mother and look after his sister. He lifted Alice Samantha into his arms and hugged her tightly, kissing her on the cheek. He instructed her to be a good girl and to do as her mother said. Turning to Glenda, he embraced his wife and whispered in her ear, "I love you, and I will miss you so much." Glenda straightened and held her head high, her face bearing strength for her children's sake. But as she'd kissed her husband, she was gripped by a shudder of anxiety flowing through her body. Being the strong woman that she was, she dare not show her hidden fear to her husband. As the door closed with solemnity behind Frederick, his 3 family members just stood there, none of them wanting to speak. Frederick casually strolled the short distance to the railway station, bound for Southampton, fantastical plans racing through his head. Not long after Frederick had left, Glenda, Jacob, and Alice Samantha were at their respective places at work. Jacob Albert was 16 and had been learning his trade since he was 12 and was a hard-working young man. He didn't possess his father's genius with numbers, but what he lacked academically, he excelled in many other ways. He was an unsurpassed organizer, and, like his grandmother, he found the future fascinating. Being raised by Glenda, he was part of a new breed of men that didn't see women as second-class citizens. He understood the rich tapestry of his grandmother's life and observed how hard his mother worked, equaling anyone else within the company, if not better than most. At only 16, standing 6 feet tall, he was a man in his own right and had modeled himself on his father. Jacob was certainly proving that the choice of his middle name was a good one. He knew all about Albert Winters and held him in the highest esteem. Like his great-uncle, John Winters, Jacob Albert was running the dispatch department with ease and doing the job very well. Alice Samantha Winters, at 15 years old, had already attended many suffragette demonstrations and accompanied her mother Glenda to most of the meetings that she attended. She was a thoroughly modern young woman who had been raised to know that being female would not hold her back. As the women of the family had shown all the way back to Doris, her great-grandmother, they could work just as hard as men, and with surety one day they would overcome and gain the rights that their forebears had fought for. Alice Samantha, unlike her brother, was numerically as clever as her esteemed father, and had worked closely with him since joining the company when she was 12. Beginning in the accounts department, she worked her way through the ranks, and now resided in her father's office as his second-in-command. A position of such prestige was unheard of in such a young person, never mind in a woman. She had attained her status through talent and hard work, not by her family connections. She began her working life in the accounts office by sweeping the floors and emptying the waste paper baskets. This meteoric rise, however, was secretly being helped by the same entity that had assisted her grandmother. Glenda Winters was, for the next 2 months at least, in sole charge of the business. Decisions within the company were usually agreed upon by herself and her husband, but now, for the first time, every decision would be hers, and hers alone. The office seemed somewhat bereft without Frederick. He had only been away since just after breakfast, but she was already feeling a terrible emptiness. She cast a glance up at the old clock, one of the first items Alice Winters had acquired when she'd purchased the original building, which was still telling time perfectly, and it perfectly informed her that time was going slow. Indeed, it was dragging. In stark contrast, lounging in his comfortable first-class carriage, Frederick casually leafed through the morning paper. The coal strike was now over, but it had affected both the Cunard and White Star Line, and many journeys had been canceled. Although these unexpected obstacles were worrying to Frederick, he found as he read further that coal was now getting through, and for any passenger that had booked a place upon a canceled ship, a replacement would be found. He sat back and relaxed, enjoying something that his mother would never have approved of, because Frederick was traveling first class. This was Frederick's illustrious idea. Glenda had begrudgingly agreed, owing to the length of both journeys, firstly on the train, and then aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic. The entire trip had been arranged, as far as Glenda was concerned, so she could at least have knowledge that her husband would be safe and well looked after. Frederick, on the other hand, was more concerned with enjoying the trip as a first-class citizen. He could certainly afford to splash out on a bit of luxury for himself. He had taken it upon himself, furthermore, to ensure that every journey included extras for him to enjoy. The Winters family fortune outmatched even that of the Astors, so cost wasn't even a consideration. The only difference between the Winters and the Astors' fortunes was that the Winters kept theirs a concealed secret, for all the obvious reasons. Frederick had splashed out quite the sum of money on his trip, reserving a suite of rooms on the Olympic. The main reason he'd booked these rooms on that particular steamer was that the White Star Line had boasted of their ship's luxury, gloating on how well the passengers were looked after whilst on board. In his mind's eye, he would be rubbing shoulders with elite business people, all of whom could be informed of his own business. Oh, yes, during the crossing there would be plenty of time indeed to conduct business and interact with other wealthy people. Frederick folded his newspaper and placed it back in his bag. Gazing out of the window, he pondered upon the journey ahead. He felt at ease, knowing his idea to take the business to America and open a branch in New York was economically sound. This was the obvious next step. Transporting people and goods nationwide may have been good enough for his mother, but Frederick wanted more. In fact, he was confident he could challenge both the Cunard and White Star in the transatlantic cargo and passenger trade. After a long journey south, he caught a glimpse of the magnificent vessel. The Olympic lived up every bit to all the hype he had read on its stature. It truly was auspicious, and looked to all intents and purposes the luxury liner that it was. He couldn't wait to board her. He'd finally arrived at the evening before he was due to sail, tucked comfortably and safely in his hotel. With a weary yawn, he moved away from the window, which offered such a wondrous view of the modern marvel he would traverse the Atlantic Ocean over in the next few days. Sleepily, he undid the cord on his dressing gown and removed it. Getting into bed, it didn't take long to settle down, as the first-class bed was pure luxury, and he was soundly sleeping. The following morning, the gentle ringing of a bell informed Frederick that breakfast was now being served. Making his way downstairs, the lush waft of bacon, eggs, kippers, and all manner of morning meal delights tempted his nasal passages as he sat down to a perfectly set table adorned with gleaming silverware and sparkling crystal. He was beginning to enjoy this lifestyle of the rich and famous, thinking to himself that perhaps it was time for the family to start benefiting from the money they were making. Indeed, maybe time for having a little fun. Unbeknownst to Frederick, whilst he reveled in luxury, things dramatically changed. The ink stamped on the ticket tucked safely away in his pocket began to bleed out from the edges, new letters and numbers suddenly taking their place. If he could have seen this unpredicted transition, he would know that now, instead of being for the Olympic, departing on the 24th of April 1912, it had become the Titanic, set to sail on the 10th of April 1912. Time itself had spun away, and everything around him, including his family and business back at home, had been altered as well. Within her office, Glenda was racked by a terrible, cold shudder gripping her body. At that same instant, both Jacob and Alice Samantha felt it too. Both children dashed into Glenda's office, searching her face, which mirrored their fear. In that moment, realizing they'd all experienced the same sense of foreboding for some reason, she felt compelled to look at the calendar on the wall, her mouth agape, for upon the paper was printed the 10th of April. She'd thought it was later in the month, but then suddenly realized that her husband had only departed the day before his voyage on the Titanic. Shaking her head in confusion, Glenda was the first to speak. "I take it you both felt a shudder?" Both children nodded in agreement. "Maybe it was Granny Alice, letting us know everything is going to plan?" "No," said Alice Samantha. "It's because something is wrong." Now, Alice, the ship your father boards today is unsinkable. Let's not jump to conclusions." "Mother's right, Alice. It's just one of those strange things that's always happening in our family. It's nothing to worry about," soothed Jacob, not believing a single word of what he'd just said, as he'd seen the fear in his mother's eyes. Frederick strode calmly up one of the gangplanks which guided first-class passengers onto the luxurious floating palace. Casting a glance down below, he watched on as the third-class passengers were being herded into steerage. He surmised a wry smile and shake of his head that his mother would have been amongst them, so she could save money for the company. He thought to himself, "How could you have conducted business amongst that lot of unwashed people, Mother?" This thought was interrupted by another, which like a steamroller crashed through his mind. "I would not have been on a ship going to America. Your future's plan is set, and you must stick to that plan. It is not for you to decide where the company is going financially. You, like me, simply keep it running on an even keel. Now, Frederick, I implore you, please turn around and leave this ship." The concerned voice of his deceased mother fell silent. Paying it no mind, he stepped onto the White Star Line's new flagship, embarking upon her maiden voyage. Once ensconced within his sumptuous suite of rooms, he happily unpacked his newly purchased set of handmade leather cases. He had also procured a formal tailored dinner suit for the journey as his ticket included meals at the captain's table. He was rather looking forward to mixing it up with the brandy and cigar set after dinner. He glanced at his grandfather's pocket watch and saw it was almost noon, so he made his way to the first-class promenade deck, then to the rail, to wave goodbye to Southampton and England. Stood at the rail was an intriguing gentleman dressed in Victorian garb, who stood apart from all the others milling about, and Frederick suddenly felt compelled to join him. This distinguished, elderly-looking man regarded Frederick warily, then offered his hand in friendship. "Good day, sir," said the eloquent and surprisingly strong-sounding old man. "Good day to you, sir," answered Frederick, offering a slight nod of his head. "Do I have the pleasure of addressing Mr. Frederick Winters?" "You do, sir, but you have me at a disadvantage." Frederick stared at him quizzically. "My name is unimportant. Why do you doubt your mother's words? Why are you still on board this ship?" This strange man stared straight into his eyes. Frederick was taken aback, and his mouth hung open in shock. The man's eyes narrowed as they pierced Frederick's soul. "Should you long for the splendor which this kind of life offers, I can assure you, my friend, that the rest of your life will be steeped in first-class wine and food and everything that it brings. I hope you enjoy the rest of your life, sir." The elegant man's words hung cold and heavy in the air. Trying his very best to appear unruffled, he straightened and cleared his throat. I really am sorry, but what is your name, sir? Are you one of these newfangled seers into the future, or do you just make a habit of speaking nonsense to people?" retorted an irritated Frederick. As the ship was pulled away from the quayside, the man coolly replaced his top hat upon his head and said, "The name's Dewhurst, and until we meet again, I bid you goodbye." At the other end of this black rainbow, Glenda sat at her desk with her head in her hands. The afternoon, like the morning, had dragged like the weight of an anchor, but now it was time to make her way home. Sighing heavily, she took her hat and coat from the stand and left the office. Jacob and Alice Samantha joined her just outside the building, and they meandered their way back to their townhouse, not far from the station. An uneasy quiet hung like a pall all through dinner, and it was Jacob who finally broke it. "We are all feeling it. Something awful is about to happen." Glenda looked up from her uneaten food and extended a hand to each of her children. Jacob and Alice Samantha responded in kind as their mother muttered, "I've had a feeling of dread all day. All I can say is I will be glad when your father is safely back home with us." "Me too," agreed Alice Samantha in a quivering voice, tears welling in her eyes. "Now's not the time for tears, Alice. You must be strong. I'm sure when we wake up tomorrow we will all be feeling better. It's probably sadness because your father isn't here and we are all missing him." The next morning did dawn, and the family indeed felt more at ease. After breakfast, they stoically went to work and everything seemed fine. Frederick Winters relished the fresh, salty breeze of the English Channel on his face, and the Titanic was now en route to New York. But first they would be stopping briefly at Cherbourg in France, and a stop off in Ireland to pick up passengers. At Cherbourg, after glancing around, he found it strange that people seemed to actually be leaving the boat, several of which were crew members. One such man was the first officer, who was briskly heading towards the bridge when Frederick distracted him from his task and asked why so many were disembarking. The first officer glanced about nervously, as if not wanting to be overheard, and said in a low voice, "Some of the crew don't feel at ease. They seem to think we've sailed on this vessel before, under another name, and sailors are very superstitious about such things." "How can that be? This is a brand new ship," said a stupefied Frederick. "It isn't for me to say, sir. Now, I have to deposit a key before I leave the ship," answered the first officer dismissively, hurrying away. Frederick's curiosity was now piqued, and he quickly followed after, firing questions at the man. To his credit, he attempted to answer every one of Frederick's questions, but noticed he had been chatting so long that the gangplanks were being lifted. "I'm really sorry, sir, but I must leave now," yelped the exasperated first officer, not realizing as he rushed off the ship that the key to the binocular cabinet was still in his pocket, which meant the lookouts would have to rely upon their eyes, as those were the only binoculars on board the ship. The majestic ship then set sail for Southern Ireland, which was its next port of call. Everything about the ship was perfect, except for a strange list to port, very similar to her sister ship, the Olympic. Arriving in Queenstown, the Titanic made her final docking to pick up the last of the passengers, which were mostly steerage. She then set sail for the long-awaited trip for Frederick to the United States of America. It was a beautiful day, with the sun shining down as Frederick turned his thoughts towards dinner. This was the much-anticipated event he had so looked forward to, as he would be sitting at the captain's table with some very illustrious guests. As an immaculate-looking Frederick, in his brand-new dinner suit, arrived at the table, only 2 seats were unoccupied, the captain's seat and the one directly opposite him, where John Jacob Astor IV would soon be ensconced. Bruce Ismay was already seated. He was fully aware of Frederick's intentions, so had taken an instant disliking of the man who thought he could challenge the White Star Line. Frederick had already come into contact with who he now knew as J.J. Astor over brandy and cigars the previous night, and was looking forward to carrying on the conversation from where they left off. Arriving fashionably late, the captain and Mr. Astor came in together and joined the party. Dinner was a magnificent affair, with the finest foods that Frederick had ever seen. He particularly enjoyed the caviar blinis. During the after-dinner conversation, Frederick noticed a steward delivering a letter to the captain. The captain's face took on a worried expression, and Mr. Ismay inquired as to why he appeared dismayed. It's nothing to worry about. Just another ice warning," said a very calm captain. Inside, however, his guts were churning as he stood and excused himself, then made his way straight to the bridge. As the captain briskly entered the bridge, he said, "Mr. Lightoller, you requested my presence?" "I did indeed, sir. This is the third ice warning, so I was wondering when you would have me slow the vessel down, sir." "Do you have people posted to look out for bergs?" "Indeed I do, sir. I have 2 men in the crow's nest." He paused briefly, gulped, and looked down. "Whatever is the matter, man? You are behaving out of character." Second Officer Lightoller raised his head to meet his captain's gaze and croaked, "They have no binoculars, sir." "Why on earth have they not taken the binoculars with them, Mr. Lightoller?" demanded the captain. Lightoller's eyes once again shifted to the deck and said, "I was unable to retrieve them from the cupboard, as the key is missing, sir." Managing to maintain his composure, the captain replied, "It's a very calm sea, Mr. Lightoller. Keep a sharp eye and maintain speed and heading, and inform me if the situation worsens. I shall sleep in the chart room tonight. Have the carpenter change the cabinet lock at first light." "Aye, aye, Captain," said Sub-Lieutenant Charles Herbert Lightoller, the ship's second officer. With no regard for the ice warnings, knowing that the lookouts had nothing to aid their vision, the oblivious ship steamed on into that fateful night, and the watch changed as First Officer Lieutenant William Murdoch relieved Second Officer Lightoller. As the ship forged blindly ahead, a mountainous shadow crept across the horizon, unseen by the 2 men in the crow's nest due to the calmness of the sea and the lack of any waters breaking against the iceberg. The awaiting ship that bobbed calmly in the water, only a few nautical miles away, confidential to all but selected members of the crew and Ismay, would remain completely undetected. Within the belly of the sleepy Titanic, most folks had retired to bed. A good few, however, were still awake, including a group of gentlemen playing cards, drinking brandy, and smoking cigars. In amongst this elite group of gentlemen should have been Frederick Winters, reveling in his new status in society. He'd suddenly had a change of heart after his meal with the captain and the others. His mother's words had come back to haunt him, and inexplicably he felt compelled to request that one of the stewards exchange his suite of rooms with someone from second class. The steward dutifully fulfilled his request, not understanding the reasoning behind it. Frederick was, in actual fact, outside on deck, taking in some air, for a fearful dread had fallen over him like a blackened shroud. He looked up from the blackness of the nearly frozen ocean, catching the eye of the gentleman he'd last seen in Southampton by the side rail of the ship upon departure. "Mr. Dewhurst, we meet again." He offered a weak smile, apologetically feeling worry for his prior behavior. "Indeed we do, Mr. Winters, as I said we would," said a solemn Dewhurst as he shook Frederick Winters' hand. At that very instant, glasses hurtled off the tables as a massive shudder rocked the ship. Dewhurst let go of Frederick's hand, shook his head sadly, then turned and walked away. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, Frederick, along with 1,500 other people, had become a statistic in history.